Hello everyone, welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. So today is 6th May 2025 and today we have some very important topics for the discussion. So without any further delay, let's get into the discussion and let's try to understand all these important articles in a very detailed manner. And the first article, which is very important, particularly for your General Studies paper 2, and this article has been given in the last page of today's The Hindu newspaper, and this is about the conservation of forests and the biodiversity protection along with protection of indigenous rights. Now if you can look into the context of this article, it says that around the world, protection and conservation of environment, ecosystem and biodiversity is very important. And in recent times, we have been experiencing the faster degradation of the biodiversity. However, the problem here is that across the world, governments have been undertaking number of measures to protect the biodiversity, but those measures have been either sidelining or neglecting the indigenous people or the local communities. Here, the problem is that those protection and conservation measures of biodiversity are not integrating the indigenous people and local communities, and in fact they play very important role when it comes to the protection and conservation of the biodiversity, because the primary reason is that they easily integrate their lives and livelihoods with the protection and conservation of the biodiversity. And you could see here there is a fundamental clash or a conflict between the protection of the environment, biodiversity protection, and the protection of rights of the indigenous people. However, in this backdrop, in India, we also have the Forest Rights Act of 2006. The primary objective of the Forest Rights Act of 2006 is to protect the rights of the indigenous communities. However, along with that, we also have the Biodiversity Act that was framed in 2002. So essentially what I am trying to say is that India to some extent made efforts to integrate the biodiversity conservation, biodiversity protection along with the protection of the rights of the indigenous communities. However, it is clearly said that the Indian Forest Rights Act that was framed and passed in the year 2006, it actually offers a unique legal framework and that integrates biodiversity conservation with the rights and the traditional knowledge of the Adivasis and other forest dependent communities. And in fact, we cannot neglect or sideline the role of the local communities when it comes to the conservation and the protection of the natural resources and the biodiversity as well. Now we'll understand in a very detailed way how the Forest Rights Act makes India different from other countries. Now what is the trend that we have been observing across the world when it comes to the protection of the environment? So it is true that there are certain policies and measures which are put in place by number of countries, but those policies are neglecting the role of the local communities when it comes to the protection of the environment and the biodiversity. However, the Forest Rights Act, which is otherwise called as the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act 2006. So it is commonly known as the Forest Rights Act. Now, if I can tell you in a very simple language, there are certain communities who integrated their lives with the forests. So who are living in those forests from generations. And through the Forest Rights Act, we have been giving the legal recognition to their rights. And this is what the Forest Rights Act is all about. So thereby, this particular piece of legislation offers a progressive legal model, and that legal model could integrate the indigenous rights with the biodiversity conservation that the other countries which neglect the local communities and their important and critical role. And in fact, it actually embodies the Forest Rights Act actually embodies all these principles, and it also provides a comprehensive legal framework for securing the forest tenure or people who are living in those forests. Right, so a number of Adivasis or the local communities, they are living in those forests since generations, and it is very very important to recognize the rights of those traditional forest dwellers. And in fact, it is a step in the right direction when it comes to the environment protection, conservation, and also protecting the existing biodiversity as well. And in fact, it is being said that there are certain key contributions that are being made by the Forest Rights Act. Now, the Forest Rights Act rightly recognized the historical injustice that has been faced by the Adivasis and other traditional forest dwellers since generations. And in fact, they were denied the legal rights as well. However, the Forest Rights Act has rightly recognized the historical injustice, and now it is according certain legal rights to the traditional forest dwellers or Adivasi communities. And apart from that, the Forest Rights Act also aimed to empower the Gram Sabhas as well. So we all knew that at the local level, Gram Sabhas play a very very important role when it comes to the participatory governance. And in fact, it is also a symbol of democratic decentralization at the grassroots level. So therefore, the Forest Rights Act, along with recognizing the historical injustice that these Adivasis have gone through, it also empowers the Gram Sabhas at the local level. And in fact, at the local level, Gram Sabhas play a very very important role in managing and also governing the community forest resources on which they have certain rights. And apart from that, the traditional forest dwellers or the Forest Rights Act also recognize a different range of rights. For example, these communities have individual rights as well as the community rights as well. So therefore, the Forest Rights Act has recognized both individual rights and community rights over the forest produce, biodiversity, and even the traditional knowledge as well. Right, so we could say that this is a comprehensive piece of legislation that has recognized the multiple dimensions of historical injustice that the Adivasis have gone through, and at the same time it has also rightly recognized the need for the forest conservation, biodiversity protection, and the critical role that these forest communities play in achieving this objective. However, the Forest Rights Act also is in line with the bottom-up approach, and in fact we consider a bottom-up approach is critical and very very important for the democratic decentralization or a better implementation of any program. So it is generally said that that particular program should have the bottom up approach rather than the top down approach. So therefore, the Forest Rights Act has also provided for the bottom up approach to forest governance. However, in different parts of the world, number of countries have adopted the top-down approach when it comes to the protection and conservation of environment and biodiversity. However, when India adopted the bottom-up approach through the Forest Rights Act or Panchayat Extension to the Scheduled Areas Act 1996, so India has rightly integrated the indigenous communities, the local communities, in the conservation and protection of the forest and the biodiversity, along with protection of rights of these local communities. Right, so we can say that these are some of the important contributions of the Forest Rights Act. Now, in this context, we'll understand why the indigenous people and the local communities are very very important for protection of the biodiversity. Remember that at the international level or at the global level, we have a convention on biodiversity, right? So there is a convention on biodiversity, and in order to implement, because India is also party to the convention on biodiversity, in order to implement this very same convention, India also framed the Biodiversity Act in the year 2002. India framed the Biodiversity Act. So, however, this Biodiversity Act has rightly recognized the importance of the local communities and indigenous people. So, globally, all around the world, there is a growing recognition that these indigenous communities are crucial for conservation. Now, even if you see the tribal areas in different parts of India, so they actively participate in afforestation. They also protect the existing environment, right? So you might have heard about the sacred groves in different parts of India, where tribals associate these forests with the cultural importance and religious importance, and they play a very, very important role in protection and conservation of the existing forest resources. So therefore, we cannot neglect the role that these indigenous communities can actually play in the conservation and protection of biodiversity. So this is one thing. However, research has actually shown that biodiversity can actually thrive better in those territories where those biodiversity or environment is managed by the indigenous people and local communities, and this is absolutely true in India also. When you integrate the local communities in the conservation and protection of the environment and existing forest biodiversity, so they play a very, very important role because they are the natural custodians of the existing forest resources. However, as I have already told you that there are certain international frameworks which have recognized the role of the indigenous communities or the local communities. And one such framework which has rightly recognized the role of indigenous communities is the Convention on Biological Diversity. So through Article 8, Clause J, this particular convention on biological diversity, it actually asked the countries which are party to the Convention on Biological Diversity to respect and also integrate the traditional knowledge and other practices in the biodiversity conservation. So this is what the Convention on Biological Diversity actually mandates, to protect the indigenous communities and their traditional knowledge and practices in the protection of the biodiversity. And second global framework is United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People that was adopted in the year 2007. And this declaration of UN has affirmed the rights of indigenous people and local communities to manage their own lands and the resources as well. And another very important framework at the global level is Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework of 2022. And in fact, this particular biodiversity framework actually envisions inclusive conservation, including the traditional local communities. So in fact, it actually targets 30 by 30. So 30 by 30 essentially means that it aims to bring 30% of the world's land and oceans under the conservation by the year 2030. So if you have seen a question which is saying about 30 by 30, it essentially talking about the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework of 2022. However, in order to achieve this objective of 30 by 30, community participation is very important. Right? So this also envisions a direct community participation for the protection and conservation of biodiversity, and also to achieve the objective, to achieve the goal of 30 by 30 by 2030. Right? So it is rightly aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals framework, and those Sustainable Development Goals must be achieved by 2030. However, despite having such a global frameworks, and those frameworks are also urging the member countries to integrate the local communities as part of the biodiversity protection and conservation, the implementation largely remains uneven all across the world. And in fact, the fortress style conservation, so fortress style conservation in the sense that if you have recognized a certain area which is ecologically very sensitive area, so you declare it as a national park, wildlife sanctuary or a biosphere reserve, and you don't allow any one to venture into those forests. And even if the local communities are living in those reserved forests or that protected area, so you are easily displacing them out of those reserved forests. So on the pretext that we need to protect the environment, and the local communities may pose a threat to the protection and conservation of the environment. So this is what is called as the fortress style conservation, and this fortress style conservation approach adopted by the states displace the communities in several places, and it is also sometimes a common phenomenon in India as well, displacement of the traditional local communities. However, if you could look into the constitutional and legal support for the indigenous people and the local communities, and in fact the constitution itself has provided certain rights for the local communities, particularly the Adivasis. And there are several legislative frameworks also. For example, the Forest Rights Act that was passed in the year 2006, and apart from that, the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act 1996. So these legislations were already passed. Now it is being said that India does not officially use the term indigenous people, but it has a strong constitutional framework to support the scheduled tribe populations or its Adivasi populations. And in fact, if we look into the constitution for the provisions specifically for the local communities, so we have the fifth schedule. So fifth schedule talking about the administration and governance of certain tribal areas. However, a sixth schedule is talking about the administration and governance of certain tribal areas in some states such as Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura and Mizoram, right? So sixth schedule specifically talking about the tribal areas in Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura and Mizoram, right? So these two schedules in the constitution talking about the local communities or indigenous communities. And apart from that, Indian Constitution Article 244 and 244A, so that also enables tribal governance in those scheduled areas that we have just mentioned. However, it is being said that India is a country with a large number of Adivasis or a tribal population, because as of now India has around 104 million Adivasis, 104 million Adivasis, and world's largest indigenous population in a single country. So therefore it is an imperative on the part of the government to involve the Adivasis or the local communities in the conservation and protection of the forests, environment and biodiversity, because remember that these local communities, they have integrated their lives with the environment and biodiversity. So therefore they have a certain traditional knowledge for the protection and conservation of forests. So therefore we need to use the traditional knowledge for the conservation purposes. And in fact, legislations like Forest Rights Act, Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act, so those legislations allow unique and legally supported model of a decentralized democratic resource management in line with the bottom-up approach to empower these local communities and indigenous people. And on this slide you can see here there are certain particularly vulnerable tribal groups. So within tribal groups there are certain tribal groups who are considered as particularly vulnerable tribal groups, and in fact in UPSC prelims this was asked. So there are 75 particularly vulnerable tribal groups in India, and Odisha is the state with large number of particularly vulnerable tribal groups, followed by Bihar. And Bihar and Jharkhand, so together have 9 particularly vulnerable tribal groups, and Chhattisgarh and MP have 7 particularly vulnerable tribal groups, right? So different particularly vulnerable tribal groups, if you want you can go through this as well, because it is very, very important, right? So next, there are certain gaps which are actually existing, right? So gaps are existing between policy and practice. So it is not enough if you have framed the policy but you are not implementing the policy, right? So policies are on paper, but you have to implement those policies. You have to bring those policies into practice, and that is very, very important, right? So you have framed the Forest Rights Act, you have also framed the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act to integrate the tribal communities and tribal knowledge into the forest and ecosystem conservation. That is good, but we need to bring these policies into practice, and that is very, very important here. The Forest Rights Act has not been effectively implemented in many states. That is the main problem, right? So different states have implemented this Forest Rights Act in a different manner and in different degrees, right? So in fact, many communities in different states, they still avoid their title recognition, right? So there are certain problems, certain challenges which are existing in the implementation of the Forest Rights Act, and those problems and challenges need to be identified and they have to be sorted out. And in fact, displacement of the tribal communities, displacement of the local communities under the protected areas is also another major problem that India has been facing. So it is being said that India has over 1134 protected areas. But out of 1134 protected areas, at least 6 lakh people have been displaced due to the conservation models that the government has been adopting. So this type of a conservation models are known as fortress style conservation models, and these conservation models will lead to the displacement of tribal communities. So thirdly, governments are also updating the biodiversity action plans, right? So in fact, India's new biodiversity action plan under the Convention on Biological Diversity actually mentioned about the bottom-up governance or bottom-up approach, right? So bottom-up governance or bottom-up approach. However, it still substantially relies on state-led mechanism and does not fully integrate the Forest Rights Act framework, and that is the problem here. And similarly, the biodiversity management committees are substantially weakened, and in fact the biodiversity management committees have been created through the Biological Diversity Act of 2002, right? So there is a certain architecture that has been provided by the Biodiversity Act of 2002. At the national level, there will be a National Biodiversity Authority, state level state biodiversity boards and Union Territories Biodiversity Council, and at the district level biodiversity management committees have been established, right? So in recent times, you could see that there has been a weakening tendency or trend in the biodiversity management committees, and that is also another major problem. And in fact, without their full operationalization, inclusive biodiversity governance is very, very difficult as well. So therefore, we need to bridge the gap between the policy and the practice, and that's how we can integrate the tribal communities, the local communities, into the forest conservation and the biodiversity protection. So I hope you have understood this. And the next topic is Indus Water Treaty. Now, recently, we had the terrorist attack in Pahalgam, right? So because of this terrorist attack in Jammu and Kashmir, a number of civilians, particularly tourists, were died. And in fact, there are no doubts that this terrorist attack has been sponsored by Pakistan, right? So because Pakistan has been time and again promoting the cross-border terrorism, and because of the cross-border terrorism, Jammu and Kashmir and other parts of India continues to suffer, right? So however, in response to this Pakistani sponsored terrorist attack in Jammu and Kashmir that killed 26 tourists, Indian government had taken some immediate steps. So what are those immediate steps? So one such measure was temporary suspension of the Indus Water Treaty that was signed in the year 1960. So apart from suspension of Indus Water Treaty, other measures are also taken. For example, a closed Wagah border. Trade has been suspended. No imports and exports are allowed into Pakistan. Pakistani nationals were also asked to leave India within 48 hours under the SAARC visa facility. So all these measures have been taken. Among all these measures, the most important measure was the suspension of Indus Water Treaty. So the context is that India declared this Indus Water Treaty of 1960 to be in abeyance. So abeyance actually means that a temporary suspension of the Indus Water Treaty, and this is in response to the continued support by Pakistan to cross-border terrorism, especially after the Pahalgam terror attack. India suspended the Indus Water Treaty of 1960. And in fact, this particular move actually signals a temporary suspension of cooperation under the treaty. Right? So India temporarily suspended the cooperation with Pakistan under the Indus Water Treaty, and it essentially aimed at pressurizing Pakistan without officially terminating the treaty. So India has not officially terminated the treaty, but India essentially aimed to increase pressure on Pakistan for its continued support to the cross-border terrorism. I hope it is clear for you. Now, when we talk about the Indus Water Treaty, so please understand that the Indus Water Treaty was signed in the year 1960. It was brokered by World Bank. So under the Indus Water Treaty, there are 6 rivers, and out of 6 rivers, Indus, Jhelum and Chenab are called as the Western rivers. Right? So they are called as the Western rivers. And Ravi, Beas and Sutlej are called as the Eastern rivers. They are Eastern rivers. So under the Indus Water Treaty framework, the Western rivers such as Indus, Jhelum, Chenab were given to Pakistan. Rights over these rivers given to Pakistan, and rights over the Eastern rivers such as Ravi, Beas and Sutlej was given to India. Since the Western rivers also flow through the Kashmir region, right? So Kashmir is an integral part of India, and almost all rivers of the Indus water system flows through India. So India's cooperation is very, very important for Pakistan to get uninterrupted supplies of water. But after Pakistan continues to support the cross-border terrorism, and after this Pahalgam terror attack, so India has decided to suspend the Indus Water Treaty. So under the Indus Water Treaty, the Western rivers were allocated to Pakistan. The waters from the Western rivers were allocated to the Pakistan. That means that India will not share any hydrological data. So India will not obey the terms of the treaty as well, and that could starve Pakistan of water resources. So India has also been terming that the Indus Water Treaty is arbitrary and indiscriminatory because 80% of the waters of the Indus water system have been allocated to Pakistan, and just 20% of the water has been given to India. And because of that reason, India has been asking for the review of the Indus Water Treaty as well. Right? So I hope you have understood this. It is clear. Now we'll understand the legal standing of India's temporary suspension of Indus Water Treaty and the strategic calculation that has been involved. Now here the term abeyance, so that means a temporary suspension of the treaty. It has no legal recognition under the Indus Water Treaty, and it also has no legal recognition under Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. So this Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties was signed in the year 1969, but India is not party to the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties, right? So therefore, this abeyance or temporary suspension has a no legal recognition. However, India, since it is not a party to the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties 1969, even under a customary international law, so there is a simple international law which has been existing, and it is also expected that every country must follow this customary international law, right? So that it will result in a rules-based order, across the world. So it is general expectation. However, under the customary international law also, a unilateral suspension of the Indus Water Treaty and its obligations are not legally valid. Thereby, the move of suspension of the Indus Water Treaty by India is just considered as a symbolic move, but not an enforceable move. right? So the author has been telling that it is not a move that could be enforceable, rather it is just a symbolic move so that India could actually put pressure on Pakistan, right? So these views are the personal of purely personal for the author. And in fact, article 12 clause 3 and 4 of the Indus Water Treaty, there are certain constraints, right? So if India wanted to unilaterally exit out of the Indus Water Treaty, so there are certain constraints. What are those constraints? For example, article 12 clause 3 and 4 of the Indus Water Treaty mandated a mutual ratification for a modification or termination. So if any party to the convention or a treaty, if they wanted to terminate a treaty, it requires a mutual ratification. In this case, both Pakistan and India mutually ratify such a termination, otherwise it is not valid, and that is one concern here. Similarly, the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties 1969 also has a certain articles, article 60 and 62. And it allows for the suspension of any international treaty only in cases of material breach, impossibility, or the fundamental changes. However, none of these India has invoked at this point of time. So therefore, it has limited India's overall legal maneuverability when it comes to the suspension or termination of the Indus Water Treaty legally. So the author has been telling us that legally suspending a treaty unilaterally is not possible. And in fact, so this is considered as a tactical pause in the treaty implementation, rather the permanent suspension of the treaty, that is legally not possible. So this temporary suspension actually allows India withhold the procedural cooperation with the Pakistan, that India was cooperating with Pakistan on many fronts under the Indus Water Treaty earlier, but Pakistan has been continues to support the cross-border terrorism. So therefore, a sharing of hydrological data, it is part of the cooperation between India and Pakistan under Indus Water Treaty, and notifying the reservoir operations, thereby ultimately impairing Pakistan's flood forecasting and even the water security scenarios while avoiding the overt treaty violation. Right? So India wanted to show itself as a country which has not violated the obligations under the Indus Water Treaty. It has temporarily suspended cooperation with Pakistan. However, it is being said that it is part of a two-level game. So two-level game in the sense that the domestic sentiment and also the diplomatic signal to Pakistan. So here the diplomatic signal to Pakistan and the domestic sentiment of Indians, because after this Pahalgam terrorist attack, people have been demanding a strong action against Pakistan, because Pakistan has been continuously supporting the cross-border terrorism. So in order to satisfy the urge of the people in India, the government has taken this immediate step of temporarily suspending the Indus Water Treaty. So the Cabinet Committee on Security likely adopted this abeyance to satisfy the public sentiment. Thereby, it has shown a decisive action after the Pahalgam terror attack. And in fact, so to gain room for infrastructure advancement on run-of-the-river projects on western rivers like Rattle and Tulbul. So this is also true that if we wanted to use the waters on the western rivers at a sustainable scale, we need to have infrastructure. So as of now, India is lacking that infrastructure. However, in the long term, India should have plans to build infrastructure so that it may be possible in future that India could actually divert a certain quantity of water to fulfill its domestic requirements, because with climate change, with the less availability of water resources and water scarcity situation in many parts of India, it is very, very important that we need to use the existing water resources wisely, and there is also a need to review this Indus Water Treaty as well. However, using Indus Water Treaty by the government as a counter-terror tool has a high stake gamble. So it is considered as a high stake gamble because Pakistan sees it as an external existential threat. Now, existential threat in the sense that 80% of the waters have been allocated to Pakistan under Indus Water Treaty, and in fact almost entire economy of Pakistan is dependent on these waters, whether it is agriculture or any other sector, but they have majorly dependent on the river waters. Because of that reason, Pakistan has been considering this as an existential threat. So however, as of now, Pakistan has been going through internal instability, and it has also experiencing weakened military and civil dynamics. So therefore it could result in international escalation or misinterpretation of India's action as well. So this is also another major challenge that India needs to cope up with. However, so despite having a political will on the part of India, so India's hydel infrastructure projects have been facing regulatory, environmental, procedural hurdles, right? So delays in the construction of the existing projects is a challenge because that could limit the immediate material benefits from suspending the treaty for India. And in fact, what will be the long-term strategic and environmental and global repercussions on this? So if we can specifically talk about the long-term strategic and environmental global repercussions, India's unilateral invocation of abeyance, so it could undermine the image of India as a responsible global actor, and it could potentially invite international legal proceedings under the Permanent Court of Arbitration or International Court of Justice. As a country which has been looking to get a seat at the global high table, at this point of time, India may not be able to afford this. And apart from that, accelerated project execution in the Indus Basin. So Indus Basin is actually considered as a seismically and ecologically fragile region. So if you are accelerating the project execution, and that may lead to sidelining or compromising the structural integrity of such buildings or such dams, so that may result in biodiversity loss, ecological imbalances, and even long-term water insecurity, specifically in Jammu and Kashmir and the Ladakh regions. So therefore, the author has been finally suggesting that India must balance the national security concerns, public sentiment, and the ecological sustainability by ensuring its actions are perfectly aligned with the treaty obligations, international norms, democratic accountability, and at the same time avoiding over militarization of the natural resources. So he says that the natural resources should not be militarized, right? But since Pakistan has been continuously supporting terrorism, so India need to adopt such measures. It is very, very important, right? Because Pakistan is not in a position to even take any measures to stop such terrorist acts against Indians. So therefore, it is very, very important that Pakistan should be forced to stop its support to the cross-border terrorism, and militarizing the natural resources is one such way, and that could be completely justified, right? So there are a number of other projects which are already undertaken by the government of India under these rivers in the Indus water system, so you can go through with this, right? This is also very important, and if you want any additional details, because we have already discussed this, so you can go through this as well. So the next important topic is the Vizhinjam port is a maritime hub for India. So in fact, we have already discussed about this, and this Vizhinjam port is also one of the most important transshipment hub in India, right? So we'll understand what is its importance and where it is located, all these important details. So Vizhinjam International Deep Water Multi-Purpose Seaport, so it is located where? It is located in Kerala. And in fact, this Vizhinjam International Deep Water Multi-Purpose Seaport is considered as India's first dedicated transshipment port. And in fact, this particular port has been developed by PPP model by the government of Kerala and Adani Ports. and this will be operational this has become operational in July 2024. However, this Vizhinjam port is a maritime hub because it represents a significant shift in India's maritime trade capabilities and aiming to reduce dependency on foreign transshipment hubs. So earlier, India significantly dependent on the foreign transshipment hubs like Singapore and even Colombo as well, right? So India's dependence on those countries will be substantially reduced now if we have developed because we have developed this Vizhinjam multi-purpose deep water port. Now, what is the strategic and economic significance of this Vizhinjam deep water port? Right, so this particular port will help us reduce our foreign dependency, because as of now we have substantially dependent on ports like Colombo and Singapore as a transshipment hubs, and in fact it is said that 75% of India's cargo passes through the ports like Colombo and Singapore. So thereby it was actually resulted in the revenue losses of 200 to 220 million every year. And in fact, this Vizhinjam port is also having such certain geographical and structural advantages as well, because it is having a natural draft of around 20 meters, and its location is also very close to the natural shipping routes, right? So it is very close to the natural shipping routes and Indo-Pacific as an emerging geostrategic construct. So the ultra-large container vessels can easily dock without any deviation, and thereby substantially lowering the cost as well, and it can actually play a very important role as a transshipment hub in India. And in fact, this Vizhinjam port is considered as India's first semi-automated port. It has equipped with artificial intelligence powered traffic management, remote controlled quarry cranes, and even it substantially reduced the vessel turnaround time as well. However, so when we talk about the connectivity and future roadmap of this Vizhinjam port, so hinterland connectivity with this Vizhinjam port is very important, because efficient integration with the road networks, rail networks, so that actually makes a seamless cargo distribution to South India's industrial zones, and it will also help to reduce the logistic cost as well. Similarly, in future, there are expansion plans of this Vizhinjam port. And in fact, it is also expected that an additional investment of around 9,500 crore would be made, and the investment aims to develop the allied logistics and warehousing facilities in this Vizhinjam port. And similarly, this port is expected to have the transformational potential if it is implemented efficiently and effectively, because this can emerge as a South Asia's major transshipment hub in near future, complementing India's Sagarmala vision. So we have Sagarmala vision, and it could rightly complement India's Sagarmala vision, and it is also located at the right place when it comes to the global transshipment, and that's why it is expected that this port will play a very important role as a global transshipment hub. So that's all in this lecture, and I hope you have understood everything. And even if you have any doubts regarding this lecture, so please feel free to ask us, and you could type those doubts in the comment section and we'll address those doubts. Thank you.